Welcome, viewers and listeners, to episode 120 on Overdose and Chill Live. I'm Paul Yuen, the commercial director for Hong Kong, and I'm joined by Todd, our founder. Today, we're going to be talking about composable commerce, but before we get into it, we are broadcasting live on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. If you have any questions or anything you'd like to address, please leave them in the comments, and we are happy to jump in and answer. So just to kind of contextualize a little bit of what we're looking to do today, we're looking to do a little bit of demystification around the terms, monolith, headless, as well as composable. And the goal today is trying to give you kind of a breakdown of what all of those things mean, and hopefully you can take away from this a kind of a little bit of understanding of where do I sit. What does composable mean for me, and does it even make sense for me? So before we jump into that, I'd like to just do a quick round of introductions. I know Todd here is on the line. So Todd, maybe just a little bit of background about your role and maybe how you got started in e-commerce.
Yeah, for sure, Paul. Thank you for inviting me on today. So I guess this is about my 50th chill episode I've been in. So most people will know who I am. So I founded Overdose with Ryan back in, I think it was like 2017. And so we've scaled up from there. We're a team of 450 guys around the world now. And we've kind of been through every generation of commerce. So be it through, old school open source monoliths and through SaaS, and now riding that wave of composable that is taking the world by storm at the moment.
Awesome. And yeah, just for context, I might not have been through quite as long of the evolutionary steps that we see with e-commerce platforms. But I'd cut my teeth really around email marketing. I got into the e-commerce space actually doing print fulfillment as one of the many providers who was doing that as a plugin on platforms like Shopify and Magento. And most recently, I came from the technology world again of doing personalization. So hopefully it can offer a little bit of perspective there, as well as we kind of going into where the platforms are going to be headed. So with that being said, maybe we can jump and get started with the history of monoliths. So what is this term monolith, and what is the prevalence? Why do we see such a big prevalence in certain kind of Asian countries here?
Yeah, for sure. So I think monolith is often perceived as a dirty word, right, Paul? When it's thrown around as quite a negative term. Monolithic architectures, we all need to be very, very thankful for, because these are the products that, in a pre-SaaS environment, defined the commerce ecosystem. So your traditional view of a monolith is literally a monolithic statue, right? So the concept there is that your front end, your database, your integrations, your customer data, everything is inside one box, okay? Now, that was an incredible evolution because historically, way back sort of, 2010s, people were custom building their own pieces of software, right? And this was literally buying CD-ROMs and plugging them in. And you were building your own databases on different servers and, different front-end solutions. And what's quite interesting is actually sort of 15, 20 years later, we've almost come back full circle to where that started, right? But what monolithic did was it pulled together all of those needs, and it framed a solution that allowed retailers to get to market, right? And in many ways, a monolith is still the right solution for many retailers, right? So the fact that I can go and buy something that is packaged, that does what it says on the box and cures most of my woes. I only have to have one relationship with a vendor. In many ways, it works, right? Where we've seen the evolution off the back of that is that as digital has evolved, the complexity has come with it, right? So we're trading, groups trading multiple brands, trading in multiple locations, multiple inventory sets. We're selling things through multiple channels, not just our own websites, social selling on third-party marketplaces. More and more people are starting to spin up their own apps, IoT, wearables and Alexa skills and things like that. So the biggest thing that's fundamentally changed in the world of commerce is where the transaction happens, right? That's the biggest fundamental change. And you'll see that every point of investment that you see in the market through VCs into products and platforms and buy now, pay later, social shopping, everything is chasing the transaction. And with the diversification and that explosion of I can now transact anywhere, I don't just need to go in store. I can buy through Instagram. I can buy off the marketplace. I can buy at a kiosk inside your store. I literally had to do that last night, Paul. We went to a rugby game. I was one ticket short, and I literally bought a ticket at a kiosk that was a version of their website. And no longer was I speaking to someone through a gate and handing over my credit card. And off the back of that, they captured all of my information, phone number, had to approve that, my date of birth, my home address, and now I'm going to get spammed with rugby tickets.
Yeah.
But essentially, that's what a monolith is. A monolith is a single all-in-one boxed solution, and it doesn't define the technology that sits behind it. So you can have a SaaS solution that's actually a monolith, right? So if you've got a SaaS solution that does everything you need to do, then that's a monolith, right? It just means an all-in-one box. And it's often been used as a dirty word, and evolution has happened off the back of there, but it's not something that people should be scared of, because in many times it's the right thing for retailers. But today we're going to talk a little bit about how we've evolved out of that space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Todd, just for a little bit of context, obviously there are a lot of kind of legacy platforms out there. What would be some of names that we might know as or think of as monoliths?
Yeah, so without wanting for me to get 1,000 DMs, which is probably going to happen off the back of this call, the majority of those platforms that people in the industry would kind of name drop as a monolith have actually evolved tremendously, right? So
sure.
Historically, that would have been something like a Magento, an SAP Commerce, a Hybris, in some shape and form, a Salesforce Commerce Cloud as well, right? And there is stuff that's dead now, that's gone. If you think about, do you remember the days of CubeCart and OS Commerce and stuff like that, right?
But maybe a bit before my time, but yeah. Oracle ATGs.
That's where these gray hair comes from, mate. Yeah. So a lot of those platforms, though, they are all moving towards this concept of composability, right? And all of them have been through iterations of being acquired, reintegrated, and they get bundled into product packages and suites, and then they get broken apart again and exploded out through there. So as we get more into this concept of composability, I think what's important for the whole audience to understand is that composability is a concept. It's not delineated immediately just to one or two platforms, right? Now, there are a couple of platforms that have evolved that are embracing pure composability, and it's all that they do. And it's all that they can do, So if you think of products like your commerce tools and maybe your Sprikers of the world, right? Those products are defined very specifically to only work in a composable environment. But if you look at the other end of the spectrum and these monoliths, what's happening in those organizations is they're taking that all-in-one box and they're starting to explode it, right? So you're moving from this concept of one box and you turn the bits on and off into a modular view of the world where you pick your pieces that you specifically want for that build. So you'll certainly see that with the evolution of, Adobe's doing some great work in that space. So they've now got app builders and separation of their API layers. And if you think about it, that API layer for Adobe Commerce or Magento, it used to literally be in the source code, right, of Magento, right? Now it's going to sit as a separate product. So it means that you've got that slightly looser coupling and that diversification. Now, look, where people start to view that monolithic word is, yeah, but it's still got an Adobe logo. It's still got an SAP logo. It's still got a Salesforce logo across the top of it. But internally, if you really kind of dive into those organizations, they're breaking that apart by product teams as well. And that's the biggest fundamental change, is it's not 100 guys all working on one vision. It's now broken out into product teams where they're building these as independent units that bolt together. And you've most recently seen that with Shopify, defining, even as a SaaS platform, moving into the enterprise space, they're looking to have that level of composability, which is all about modules and how you can kind of pick and choose those pieces. So composability is a confusing term in that sense, Paul, where you can say, I want to be composable off the bat, and you go through this huge architectural conversation and picking all your pieces. But equally, for all of our friends and retailers that are on existing monolith platforms, they're going to be dragged along a composable journey anyway, because that's where everyone's going, right? So
Yep.
have this conversation again in 2 or 3 years' time. And even if you haven't migrated off that legacy platform, you're still going to be composable.
Well,
We've got
let's
Mr.
expand a
Yuen
little
coming in.
bit more on the headless and composable in a second. I'd like to just spend a little bit more time kind of summarizing the monolith. I see that Yesen just asked a question here. If monolith stacks tick most boxes, why would merchants change or want to explode the box? And I think
Great
kind of
question.
coming off of what you just mentioned there, it's also important to contextualize the time frame of all of these advances in technology. When we think about the monolith, it was at its time, kind of early days of being online, right? You had folks that were just building out websites, trying to come up with new functionality to address things like loyalty programs, point of sales, and so forth. And instead of losing the core focus of your business, maybe as a retailer, you shouldn't be spending all that time being a technology provider and coming up with your own platform with open source. Instead, the monolith was a great one-stop shop to get all this access. You didn't have to kind of go crazy overruns with development hours and time. It was a great solution for what it was at the time. And I think, as you're kind of mentioning here, we're seeing a lot more change with consumer behavior, channels in which you market and sell to. And that has caused us to kind of rethink the monolith. And as you kind of mentioned there, start thinking about breaking out into microservices or headless. So maybe you could take a go here of answering Yeston's question. If a monolith stack ticks most boxes, why would merchants want to change or want to explode that box?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think almost the word explode suggests that you have to detonate everything, right? You don't actually need to do that, right? So there's multiple approaches you can take here. So a standard approach that we've been taking in the past 2 years is what we call the strangler pattern. Now, what that means is that we are picking off parts of the business that we can segment away, right? So it might be that the first, and I know we're going to get into this, but the first part of that actually happened wasn't headless. The first part of that happened was the world you came from, Paul. It's where we said, hey, do you know what? This product does better AI personalization than what already comes in the box. So I'm willing to pay my extra $1,000 a month to get that 11 out of 10 feature, whereas what was in the box was an 8 out of 10 feature. Same happened with email, right? Same happened with on-site search, right? And you see these kind of almost like a sine wave of what happens through market of you are breaking apart components of your service base. And then at some point, those services get acquired and they get bundled and pushed back into the box, right? And we've all seen this, you worked in email, so you'll remember the days of things like Bronto, right? Was the market leading email platform, got acquired, pushed into Oracle, and then eventually disappeared as a product, right? So there's lots of kind of pieces of that happening. The main part that people have heard of is headless. That was the biggest kind of explosion or separation. And that's when you were really separating out your headless user front-end experience, how people engage with your brand, what they see on their screen, against what is the business logic that was sitting in the background. Now, that was just defining why explode's a bit of a dangerous word. But there are 4 kind of barometers that we have at Overdose for understanding, or when we recommend a fully composable environment to merchants, right? The first one is you have to have complexity in your business, okay? In fact, let me step back a step from there. First things first, composable is not a journey for everybody, okay? There is a level of complexity, time, and investment that needs to go into that, and it has to be right-sized and best case for your business. If your business doesn't fit these 4 quotients I'm going to talk you through, or at least 2 or 3 of them, then a traditional SaaS environment can be a much better solution for you, right? So first one, complexity. You just have to have this concept of multiplicity in your business. So that's multiple locations, or multiple inventory, or running multiple brands under one environment, right? That's when you tend to stretch your monolith or your SaaS environments to certain parameters and limits, and you're saying, look, I want the freedom to go beyond that. So first one, complexity. Second one, maturity. Okay. So if you are a brand that has one e-commerce manager that is doing everything in your business, and that person is doing the search, the merchandising, working with your agency, trying to coordinate socials, it's literally an e-commerce manager. Composable will be too big of a beast for you. Where it works particularly well is when you've got particular role definition within your business. So if you have someone who is head of search and merchandising, right, head of marketing, right, head of all of these independent disciplines, the key benefit of Composable for them is that we separate out the tool sets that just they need. So the person who's doing search and merchandising can't break what the team who are doing SEO or the team that are doing marketing are doing. And you're giving them defined tool sets that fit within their role structure so they become much more efficient. And that's where we've got this concept of that loose coupling. With that maturity, there also needs to be, Paul, like a genuine passion for tech. Do you know what I mean? There has to be
Yes.
a real desire to want to play with not cutting edge tool sets, but things that have just crossed the chasm, and you're in that early adopter phase, right? You are not going to go and find 10,000 brands that have already implemented this. You're going to be fairly early to market, and you'll tend to find that there is maybe a CIO or a CTO that's in that business as well. They're kind of at that level of having tech conversations.
Yeah, and Todd, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here because we're definitely going to spend a little bit of time with Composable and breaking it down by roles. But what you're touching on there with an attitude of being maybe a little bit more customer focused is, I think, an important part to touch on, because as we think about the monolith and then the transition to microservices, it's that attitude that really kind of drives that direction or change in technology. So before we kind of make the jump, into microservices, let's just summarize a little bit about the monolith. Great for its time, but
Yep.
as we kind of, look at it and it gets a little bit more mature, some of the challenges that we're seeing there is really around the single stack being just one single code, right? So you have the challenges of, okay, you've got one development team, they have to take all the feature requests from every other team, from marketing and so forth. And again, that's something that alludes to what you just mentioned around having the right mindset, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're having to roll out a customer experience, and you're having to ask your IT team to do it, and they have to balance, maintenance for the platform, your feature rollout could be 3 to 6 months for something super basic. So in that sense, we start seeing the need to maybe move to microservices where all these teams can kind of start jumping in the platform, working on the front end, working on the back end. And I think that's really kind of the start or the draw for microservices.
And you get that level of independence as well, Paul, right? Which is that the team that's doing the front end don't necessarily have to wait for the content team to have done their work to release a change, and you don't have to do these 6 weeks of huge depth of regression testing because you're scared that the button you changed over here actually changed the code for the checkout as well, right? So that loose coupling and segmentation, it genuinely improves your speed to market, but it means you've got lots more pieces and the independence. Hence, you need that maturity and that mindset to be able to quantify it through as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of big draw for microservices, right? As we have a more complex customer who wants to be engaged with in a certain way, we need to be agile with our technology. And that's really where the microservices piece comes in. And that's kind of like the latest stage of, or evolution, if you will, of how we approach platforms. I guess just kind of wrapping it up, then we have kind of a lack of agility as a potential problem with a very strict monolithic stack, even though in theory, you have all the functionality that you might immediately need for your business in one spot.
Mm-hmm.
And we do see this with things like Shopify and Magento, where you have the ability to work with integrations and other plugins and providers that are best of breed of what they do. And so that kind of enables you to maybe drop that in a little quicker versus having to deal with internal resources and development. And it
Mm-hmm.
makes microservices kind of an obvious next step, right? So one thing that we're both highlighting here, and I want to keep this a little bit Asia specific, is if we look at a lot of Western countries or organizations, typically a monolithic stack might make a ton of sense because it's, a lot of their business functionality rolled up under one roof. And maybe they need to start exploring a few different things, that are quite interesting right now, like payment options or last mile delivery, third party logistics. And maybe they even sell to a neighboring country, the US to Canada, for example. There might be a currency component, tax component, fulfillment component. And I think for a lot of the Western countries, it's still kind of like, okay, maybe we should go headless. And if we adopt headless, this whole other composable notion. But in Asia, where each country might have a very specific market cap, there is a lot more pressure there to think about selling in multiple regions. Hong Kong, for
100%.
example, selling in Singapore, selling in Taiwan, and each one of those countries has a very different type of consumer, and they need to be, addressed very differently with different pieces of technology and different microservices. So, in
I
that
think
sense,
I,
yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, I think that messaging goes not just into separate microservices, but the leveraging of that microservice per market, right? So if you think
Exactly.
about
Yep.
your traditional Australian brand, they are the same models work whether you're in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, right? And
Yep.
you might play around with different seasons, yeah. I think what most Western brands don't understand is how bloody difficult commerce is in Asia, right?
Yep.
And the density of different cultures, language, currency, tax is, it's 100K each direction, and you flipped from Malaysia up into Laos into Thailand. It diversifies so quickly, and the content is not the same Latin content. You need to be writing different script for different situations, and it's incredibly complex. And also where that conversion happens, that was one of the biggest surprises for me when learning the Asian markets, Paul, is no, we want to buy this on WeChat. We don't want to buy it off your website, and
Exactly.
that you assume is an Asian dynamic, and it's like, it's not. It's just this pocket of Asia and this pocket of Asia. But then you go into these markets and they want to shop off of a different website. They want to shop off Tmall, Shopee, Lazada. And then this
100%.
specific market comes direct to you. So it's a incredibly complex market.
And I think as a business, it's important when you come from a place like Hong Kong or Singapore where there is a specific market cap. And so you have to think about expansion. It's just the way it is, right? With especially a very global consumer. So in that sense, if we thought about a monolith, you could be sitting there as a CIO or CTO or CMO thinking, oh my God, how the heck am I going to make this monolith, adapt to each one of these platforms? Microservices, I think, is naturally what you're going to lean towards. You're going to go, okay, I could use the best of breed. I have to use certain payment and 3PL providers for these specific regions if I want to grow my business. So, as we think about microservices, I think it's a good reason now to transition a little bit more of the conversation about how microservices and going headless is really quite beneficial for those organizations. And then with Asia having its own complexities, we can then touch on maybe the composable component or way of thinking. So with that being said, if we think about microservices in Asia, I'll just run down a few of those kind of challenges that typically come to mind. We can kind of maybe touch on really quickly whether microservices do solve a lot of these challenges. What do you think?
What do I think that they solve them? Yeah, that works for me. Yeah.
Okay, so a couple of them. So one of the challenges that I see a lot with merchants in this part of the world is that they usually have to think about fulfillment. So there's a component of cross-border fulfillment or regional fulfillment. Space is an issue. So, maybe it's a case of we have items from certain inventories, or fulfillment centers that we need to put together for a single order to be delivered. Do you think that could be something that microservices really solves versus, trying to do that within a monolith?
So two key challenges there. The answer for firstly is yes. So the first challenge is your inbound inventory. What have I got available to sell? Okay, so by exploding out that API layer and then almost giving public APIs to your providers, and you'll find that now with a lot of 3PLs and service providers, they actually are willing to connect to your APIs, right? And you give them a very structured framework for that. And then you have a product in the background, like a commerce tools, that sits there and understands multi-location inventory. And then your merchandising team have the ability to choose which inventory locations am I selecting for which individual market. So this is my Singapore store. I'm only going to ship from these 2 locations. If I'm going up into North Asia, I'm going to ship from these 5 locations, right? Doesn't make any sense to ship to Singapore from China because I might already have the stock. And you start putting rules and prioritizations in there as well. So as a concept for a microservice, that's an absolute banger because you're actually doing operational, logistical best practice of how do I maximize my margin of getting that project into the retailer. The second challenge is then also, if you've got a big order, how do you break it up and get it there? Now, just as a little aside there, Paul, I recently made a $600 order from a very big retailer in New Zealand, and it took them, there's probably about 20 to 30 household items in there, and they sent 11 different parcels, and I tracked how much they paid for shipping on each of those because they gave me free shipping, and they paid over $75 in shipping, where they were literally doing it from who was the first priority in that list to kind of ship you a spoon or a fork or a knife, right? It was crazy, and literally I received a A4 size box that had 1 spoon in it, right? And it's like, okay, you guys are just throwing your margin away by trying to overservice through there. Their thought is, well, I've diversified my supply chain. I can ship from all of my stores. I've got all this inventory available. And then you break it back down, and it's like you're actually now incredibly inefficient. And you could have probably consolidated that into 2 or 3 boxes with a good microservice running for you.
I think that's a great segue into the composable piece because, headless, great. You can do all these things. It's kind of a little bit more automated in the back end. You can use the API integrations to make all these things happen. But if you actually, review it, sometimes there's a lot of chaos there. And we need a little bit more method in the madness. And I think before we transition to, the discussion around composable, I just kind of want to summarize a little bit about the benefits of headless, because as we just kind of talked about leveraging microservices, this is the idea that you're going to be decoupling your front end from the back, right? So you have multiple teams working in there. You have microservices that don't just benefit marketers, but they could also enable, folks like in logistics or shipping on the back end, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as we kind of just summarize headless, great evolutionary step from the monolith. You have a lot more control around integrations. You're moving quicker. There's a lot more agility. You can deploy some very interesting features and channels in which your shoppers can engage with you. But then we start needing to think about, okay, how do we actually add the business function and thought behind it? But actually, before we jump over into the composable piece, I just want to ask if there's anyone online who's got any questions. I know we're kind of jumping a little bit between monolith and headless at the moment, but is there any kind of questions out there at this time?
They will throw them in the comments. Raven is beavering away in the background, and she'll throw them in front of us. I actually, just whilst we're waiting for that, Paul, I think what's also a kind of an interesting segue is understanding what were the market dynamics that forced those different evolutions to happen.
Oh,
right. So
yes.
If you actually think about what headless was really doing, it was when we were in that space of where people were trying to really separate their brand out by what was the user experience, right? How cool was my front end, right?
Yep.
And yeah, there were lots of kind of bits and pieces around multiplicity and, decoupling, and we can talk about that. But the reality is it was brands wanted to do cooler stuff. That was why people started going headless. And the reason they could do cooler stuff on headless is it uses different technology, right? So people were using the front end that was baked into your box, and that has a certain set of parameters and code bases you can use around that. And sure, you can extend it, but there was still kind of some in-the-box limitations there. As soon as you went into a headless environment, it meant that you could build on any kind of code base you wanted. So everyone's spinning up these very cool JavaScript-heavy environments, lots of engagements, things moving all over the place. And then off the back of that came PWAs. And then off the back of that became everyone obsessed with speed, right? So it was really a combination of I want it faster and I want it cooler. And that's where headless came from. And I think off the back of that, where we got into Composable is exactly what you just nailed, which is, okay, we've got these really, really cool environments, but I can't keep up with the business logic in the background, right? And my back end operational complexity now doesn't match my front end complexity and agility as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just a couple little tidbits here on things like speed as well as agility in kind of a commercial setting. Deloitte, over the course of 4 weeks, analyzed mobile site data from 37 retail, travel, luxury, and lead generation brands across Europe and the US and found an 8.4% increase in conversions with retail customers and an increased average order value of 9.2% based on an 0.1 second site speed improvement. So, the idea of moving from a monolith to something that is headless and moves quickly already really helps the bottom line.
So, but that's the core market shift in consumer expectations, right, Paul? We all expect this instantness, and I've done it myself. You sit there for 10 seconds waiting for your tax rules to load up, and you go, do you know what? I've already flicked over to Instagram, and
engagement is so short. Engagement is so short, and even that translates to something like shipping, right? Like we want the fastest shipping options now more than ever before. I see. We do have a question. Do you think customers really understand the total cost of ownership of monolith versus composable offering? Now that's a great question.
It's improving. It's improving. So I look, generally where this leads to, it just says LinkedIn user. So I imagine this is someone who works at a platform. Generally speaking, the way that retailers tended to justify their purchasing and their license pricing was they just stared at the license pricing. Okay. So you looked at that one number that says, well, these guys are charging me a $50,000 license. You want to charge me a $100,000 license. I'll go with the 50, right? Now, TCO, total cost of ownership, that's basically all of your OPEX costs, right? So not what you're paying to have the site built or designed, but those ongoing costs, right? And they take the form of two key components. One is your software licensing costs, which is majority now is a SaaS-ish kind of environment. You'll probably have one or two where you've signed up to a 1 to 3 year engagement, but the majority of tool sets are going to be, month to month or, 3 monthly exits. And then the other largest component of that is what is the actual cost of your transaction? Okay. So it's where we see the biggest tension at the moment, Paul, in most markets I'm working with is what are my credit card fees, right? And as we're in this inflation-driven market at the moment, right, those numbers are going up. And so if you've gone from a 1.5, 1.7 to 2.2, are you willing to pass that back on to your user? And if you are in a monolithic environment, have you been locked into a payment processor that is forcing you to use their payment service and actually are clipping an extra 0.5% on the way through, right? So don't look at any one number in independence. You literally want to spreadsheet this all out. What are my costs? What's it going to cost when I hit 5, 10, 15, $20 million worth of revenue, and have a true understanding of the total cost of ownership? And in a composable world, that means more line items, right? Because you're going to have probably 2-3 times the amounts of bits of kit, but those kits are coming in smaller numbers, right? So you really need to map that out as a user.
But it does offer one interesting thought in terms of the way we buy technology. When I speak with a lot of merchants that are coming from monoliths, it's always the thinking of, hey, give me an RFP. Here is the list of features. Tick all these boxes. And you do find yourself just essentially selling them another monolith potentially, or understanding that this is what they feel they should be looking for. Then you bring in the concept.
I couldn't agree with you more, Paul. The amount of conversations we end up having with merchants of where they say, so tell me about headless and tell me about composable. It's like,
and then you just got to back to square one.
Yeah. You've given us a 50-page RFP that says, I want it all to be done in one box, but you want the modern tech. So yeah, there's a lot of confusion.
There is definitely some compromise. And I think, with monoliths, it's okay, great. One contract under one roof. And maybe not the best in terms of what you could be getting for certain features. But then we have the other side of microservices where it's just like, okay, good luck. You got to sign 50 different contracts, but it's still kind of that old style of thinking of, okay, you get to sign for 2 years, 3 years. It's payment up front, monthly subscription, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we kind of transition to composable, where merchants are looking to really kind of pick and choose functionality, I think that could see a big impact or change with how you buy technology. What are your thoughts on that, Todd?
100% agree. And I think the other little nuance I often see in there is when CFOs get brought into the purchasing cycles, right? Because the CFO would say, well, I saw a tick box on a spreadsheet. It does that feature. I'll take the monolith. And I've got one contract to negotiate, one contract to deal with. The difference there is that if that relationship goes south, that's a lot of stuff to unpick and unwind, right? And that's a lot of spaghetti to move.
We've had our fair share of dealing with a change in management, and then they've got this legacy monolith that they've invested 4 or 5 years worth of effort in, and it's just not up to par yet. But I do think that's a very important point there for sure.
And SaaS has changed those behaviors and those expectations as well, right, Paul? So consumer expectation of speed to market and services, and you've come from this space, and you look at what these personalization email and search boxes, what they do out of the box, literally as an install for a couple of $100 a month. 5-10 years ago, we were charging $100,000 to build that feature set, and it's a 6-month delivery window. But brands, retailers forget the amount of tech that you're actually buying that goes into that as well. So I think those purchasing behaviors are positive, and I think SaaS has driven that as much, probably more so than Composable. But what it does, which is great, Paul, is that it keeps the products honest, right? They have to have a continual roadmap. You can't sit there and rest on your laurels because you've got a 28-day notice period, and they'll jump on the hot new product, right? So it drives innovation and it drives product growth. And I think it's a net positive, but I think it's scary for SaaS businesses as well when they have to struggle with that difference between becoming a support business versus a growth business as well.
100%, but it definitely is, for the benefit of the merchant at the end of the day to have access to all of this and be able to plug it in quite quickly, and have potentially better commercial terms. I think that also kind of segues nicely into the fact of what you just mentioned about CapEx and OpEx, right? So if you're dealing with a monolith in that sense, you got a lot of fees going out the door, right? And whilst you might have bought a platform that's a sandbox to do it all, you still have to spend a lot of money on developers, technical debt, the idea that you have to update your platform, whereas of course the SaaS model negates a lot of those kind of challenges. I do notice a question here in the comment. Let's see, this is Ben Hoban.
I think you just went on mute, Paul.
I'm back. Do you lose out on consumer personalization or create a massive tech debt to keep it active on a store with headless or composable architecture?
Okay, so I imagine this relates to a specific use case that Ben's probably working through. So Ben, pretty much every technology that you're using for personalization on a front end, these are available in headless composable architecture. So if you're using a Nosto, a dynamic yield, there's a plethora of these great tool sets out there. If anything, I would say that what a headless composable architecture does is it gives you more opportunity to personalize, okay? Because we're looking at a multiple channel environment, okay? So we have all this data filtering back into one backend environment, but you are capturing multiple consumer engagement points, okay? So whether they are engaging just with your website or through Marketplace, IoT, right? The ability to merge that data together. The other trend, which we definitely haven't got time to go into today, is the rise of CDPs, customer data platforms as well, right? Which is where you're seeing, and again, if you want to go and research this, probably look at things like Lexa and Segment. Our most mature retailers are investing hard in this space at the moment, where you're picking up not just their salient action points that are happening on your website, but what else they're doing around the internet, and pushing that into an environment and then building specific audiences to drive not only on-site personalization, but outbound marketing and services as well. So I don't believe you're creating a tech debt by doing that, because what you're actually doing is you're moving your data into these specific tool sets. And then when you want to switch out the front end or leverage that data in a different channel, it's imminently available for you to be able to leverage that. And that's the decoupling, right? And it means that your personalization isn't baked into your headless environment. It's a tool set that sits akin and loosely coupled to that. However, if you are moving from a monolithic environment where all of that data is stuck inside the box, that can be a pain in the ass to get out, right? If you already have a personalization engine, they should be able to migrate that into your new environment.
That's great. And maybe we can just kind of summarize a little bit about headless. So, I mean, when we think about all these microservices, it's a revolution from monoliths, right? It gives an enormous amount of flexibility. And there are a multitude of benefits, not just to the marketer, not just to the technologist, but all facets of the business, because you're enabling teams to work at their own pace on certain aspects of the site, the back end, the customer experience, and so forth. So that's a great advantage. And I think more specifically for Asia, as we touched on, there is a need for, a lot of different microservices, things like we talked about fulfillment, payment. We talked about, last mile delivery, potentially, third-party integrations like for marketplaces, more emphasis on omni-channel. And whilst that's already a lot just for one country, with Asia, uniquely compared to the rest of the world, is we have the multi-region component. So not only do we have to do all of this for 4 different countries, we have to do it in 4 different languages and so forth. And so the idea of Composable really becomes something that's very pertinent and relevant to APAC merchants, because you have to start thinking about how to manage and have those microservices work for you. So maybe you want to give us a high level a little bit on Composable now that we can kind of think or contextualize that journey.
Yeah. So the key concept of Composable is this concept of microservices. Okay. So a microservice, an easier way to define it is that it does unique and valuable units of work. Okay. And it does them independent of everything else. So it means if you're doing something which is complex pricing models or bundling, right, for your products, that sits separate of your module that does tax, right? And these don't just sit as separate modules within one code base. They almost live independently in their own house. Right? Now, how do these talk to each other is through their APIs. Okay, so there is kind of standard understood language of how these things will connect to each other. And again, talking a little bit old school, the bits where projects used to go wrong was always integrations. It was always integrations because people didn't either want to give up their data, or they had rate limits, or they had, someone's got 5 decimal points and I only expected 2 decimal points, right? And all of those kind of, restructuring of product models and data and pricing, that always used to be the issue. But with these mature platforms, they all sign up to this thing called the MACH Alliance, M-A-C-H. And the MACH Alliance basically kind of sets out a let's all play nicely in the sandpit together, right? So one of the core things that you're seeing there, and Paul talked about the monolith, and then he talked about suite services. So if you consider someone like an Adobe and Oracle, where you buy multiple products under the same brand, what you've really got in the Composable world is what they refer to as a portfolio of services. And it's separate independent brands that are building their own products, but they're doing it in a collective nature. Okay. And the MACH Alliance is what binds them together and says, we will agree to operate in certain ways. So the ability to connect these modules together has become imminently simpler. We have these things called iPasses now, which are kind of these centralized hubs for pushing data in, translating it, spitting it back out again. So the core concept of Composable is taking your entire platform and breaking it into standardized units of work that do one thing and do it incredibly well and can operate independently from the other. So in a typical environment, that would be you've got your commerce platform, you then have an email platform, you then have a personalization platform, you might have your own independently written custom microservices that are doing your specific pricing and bundling. You then have an API layer that's connecting everything. You then have a front-end layer that sits on the top. You would have your content sitting separate to your commerce, right? So all of the copy that you're writing If you think about that, again, traditional monolithic way, everything was tight in one place, and it was really hard to reuse that content. Now we can actually use that content to say, right, this is not only driving product descriptions, this is driving some of my social postings and my blogs and what goes out on Pinterest and what goes out on PR releases. So it's that multiple usage of that because it's isolated and sits in a nice tight spot. Now, the key benefits that come off the back of that, we've talked about isolation and those services, but there's two other key benefits. One is speed to market. Okay, so you can hustle these things together very quickly if you know what you're doing. And then secondly is the flexibility. So if you fall out of love with Don's personalization engine, you can switch that out and plug another one in, because the front end understands this is a block of personalized content and I will take it from this API endpoint, right? And then I will render it in a certain way. And whether you have changed that platform out, the front end doesn't really care too much. And then the last parts of that is that all of these services are kind of like mini SaaS services. So the C in MACH stands for cloud. And essentially all those services are hosted on like an AWS or a GCP. Nothing sits on your internal servers anymore. That's banned. That's not allowed. You're not allowed the dusty cupboard anymore. And so they're kind of like these micro SaaS services, which are relatively cheap to operate. You're on a kind of a user pays environment rather than buying
highly scalable too. Right?
Highly scalable. Yeah.
That's the big thing.
Yeah. And then the very last one, that speed to market, but also the speed of that experience that you get from headless, because all the front end is doing is taking what it's told to do, right? Your front end should almost be dumb, right? And it's reading from these endpoints and it's presenting that to the user. And then it asks questions to the microservices and it gives it the answer. And if you think about your monolith, it was trying to answer the questions in the same unit of work, which is why some of those systems tended to run a little bit slower through there as well.
Todd, actually, just being respectful of time and so forth, I did want to do a kind of quick fire because, we've talked a lot about all these different platforms. I don't want folks sitting on the call thinking, oh, this just sounds like a technology thing. It's not really my department. Maybe we could think about, how headless impacts certain roles. So if I was a CMO, for example, what's the benefit of thinking about headless?
Love that angle. In fact, in one of our decks that we put out there, Paul, right, one of the core strap lines is loved by the CEO, but built for the CMO. Okay. So it's that keeping everyone happy in the organization. So what's in this for the CMO? It's the ability to make rapid changes to your environment, speed to market, not having to wait for these kind of 3-monthly sprints of releases to happen. So you can iterate, learn, evolve, test. You can change your mind. You can decide that I didn't like that. I don't like that product anymore. It's not working. And I can switch things in and out. That segregation of roles we talked about earlier as well, that you've got one person in there that is just writing content. And we have all had this, and we've all heard the horror stories of where the person who was writing content pressed the wrong buttons in admin and did a 0 price deal for every SKU on the website. It can't happen anymore because we're working in a content product. The other part of that is that the CMO can innovate, right? Genuinely can innovate and can say, I want to play around with some different layouts, right? And I don't have to go back to the designers and the tech team to get a whole new set of templates built. I've actually got some WYSIWYG tools here that I can play around with, and I'm going to run an A/B split test on these and see if circles work better than squares, or if parallax works better than deep content, right? And can actually test, measure, and learn that without the reliance on a heavy tech team and those cycles of work behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple other C-suite folks that we might want to think about, maybe CFO and CEO, and we can just kind of conclude on that. What are your thoughts?
So CFOs tend to be the hardest to convince on anything, right? My CFO included. What they need to learn through this process is that, yes, you are going to be handling multiple more invoices, but there are 2 core things on this. One, again, you can change your mind, okay? And you can back out of those contracts and switch the pieces in. So moving away from these 3 to 5 year licenses and going into that SaaS space. The second is that you do not get punished for growth. Okay. Now that tends to happen in your monolithic where you go through tiers of licensing, right? And you suddenly go across the $100,000 tier of, say it's 10 million, I don't know. And then you're charged another $100,000 until you get up to the next 10 million of revenue. Where most of these composable platforms scale is they track along with the growth of either your revenue or your number of transactions. There's a few different pricing models out there, but it's very fair and transparent growth-based pricing. And that's why that TCO is important as well, right, Paul? Because it comes back to a percentage cost of ownership, not a dollar tax on ownership.
Gotcha.
So you can build you can build it in much more accurately into your margin calcs.
And
Danny, what's Danny got to ask?
Danny asks or mentions another great feature of Composable is that you can invent many front ends and experiences that complement your mainstream or Main Street e-commerce experience. So specific consumers that have specific jobs to do can use different front ends without having to constantly try and squish features into the one front end site.
Yeah, great call, Danny. One of the areas and the biggest use cases that we recommend Composable for is for those merchants that are doing both B2C and B2B, and more commonly now B2B2C, right? So where you've got a large retailer that allows a other retailer to come on board there, almost customize that service and solution, and then sell that. So if you think about things like uniforms and stuff like that, works incredibly well through those pieces. That translates again into what you were saying, Paul, about my Korean experience needs to be very different from my Thai experience, right? And you don't need every Thai tax and shipping service on the Korean website, right? And then just hidden, because that's what we used to do. You had everything on one site and we just hid the bits you didn't need, but it still meant you were having to load all of these different versions. Whereas now we've got very, very specific use cases. And I think what you'll find, and probably more what Danny's alluding to, is the same consumer in the same market having slightly different experiences of that brand. Okay, so when you go onto the kiosk versus your mobile phone versus the app versus the website, they're all coming from one single linearity. And that also allows you, going back to your what's in it for the CMO, is that when you've got seasonal changes, to actually go and do the Easter version of the website that's only up for 2 days isn't a massive 2-month planning session, right? So those things.
Yep.
Sorry, Danny.
There's that personalization component there, and I think that's also something to consider is the idea that Yesin asked a little bit earlier about of technical debt, and just to cover that really quickly, we see a lot of kind of these feature rollouts that you might try to do with a monolithic stack, and from commercial side, I've been in conversations where it's like, oh yeah, we'd love to buy your tech, but we need to complete a basic language change on our second website, and it's going to take 6 months. And you're kind of going, well, wow, that's a big feature, or taking quite a long time. Why is that? Oh, well, we have to fix all these other problems before we can do it. And I think that's also something that should be mentioned that going headless with a lot of microservices can solve. Okay, so then more. Oh, sorry. Yep.
Let me just jump in. So I know Yestin had a question up there, is define technical debt. I think it's quite important that everyone understands that. So
yes, go for it.
Technical debt is when you bought something and now it's a pain in the ass. That's basically technical debt, right? So that manifests itself in multiple forms, right? That might be your team have become so dependent on a legacy piece of kit and they've surrounded it with manual processes that you just can't unstitch it, right? It could be that that piece of technology that you're now dependent on won't nicely integrate with these 3 new bits of kit that you want to use, right?
Yep.
So it's not that the new pieces of kit are wrong, it's that it's got this old legacy APIs. It might be that you are constantly having to pay for upgrades on that piece of kit, right? So you're basically getting taxed for it because there's security upgrades, there's version upgrades, and it keeps on coming through and having costs along the way. And the fourth is just if it slows down your speed to market and operation. And I'm going to try and get my children to stop text messaging me. It's the end of school day. Okay, so the other question on there, I know we're running out of time. Ben's question, things to avoid for businesses in a composable world. I'd say the biggest thing for me, Paul, is biting off too much than what you can really chew, right? Because you can go wild in this world of composable, right? And you can start digging. They go from holes to rabbit warrens very, very quickly, right? So being very selective on the bits that you want to achieve. I'd say what we are seeing as an agency is an evolution of resourcing models for how we do composable as well. So typically within a monolithic or a SaaS environment, it was a very structured space, right, Paul? And we'd only really deviate kind of 10, 20% away from, platform capabilities. Whereas with Composable, we can go wild in the aisles and do whatever we want. So what tends to happen now is that instead of us selling on features and, here's your fixed cost for a delivery, we're seeing more and more that retailers are actually booking dedicated resource. So it's like, right, I want to achieve this much, and we'll go, right, we think we can achieve that with 5 or 6 developers over a course of 3 to 6 months. I'm making up numbers, right? But with that commitment to resource instead of commitment to features, that gives you the ability to have complete agility and change your mind and kind of steer with the waves. And in the world that we live in, whether it's COVID or macro inflation or I can't get any stock and supply, we see more and more the internal drive to change can be really challenging if you've sold your merchant a 9-month big monolithic delivery, because it's got a defined start and a defined end. And it gets really painful for all parties to try and over deviate in that. So I'd say pick off the bits that are important to your business, roadmap it through, and really think through with your partners, what does that resourcing and commitment look like? And then off the back of that, talk to your CFO and your CEO about how you're financing that and how you're amortizing that cost within your business, because it will stop being a fixed cost and it essentially becomes a perpetual investment through there as well.
Absolutely. And I think, just personally from a perspective of commercials, it's very exciting now to be in this space at this time.
Absolutely.
I mean, it used to be, okay, if you're dealing with a monolith, oh God, all these things are going to happen. It's going to take 9 months. Everyone is going, yeesh, I don't want to go into the integration, exploration of any of those kind of things. And now with headless and microservices, it's exciting the amount of complexities we can solve. And it's actually a lot of fun thinking about, okay, what have you got? Is it a B2B setup? Is it a B2C setup? Do we need to do, custom things like, regional fulfillment, or do clients need to have certain profiles and credit? It's an exciting time. And I think it completely changes the perspective of which you think about your technology. With that being said, I know we have 2 minutes here, so I'm just going to do a quick little plug. So if you guys are, interested in learning a little bit more about, monoliths, headless, and of course the kind of approach of being composable, representatives of Overdose will be at the Retail Executive Summit Asia in Singapore on 6th of April, 2023, talking about Composable, and likely at the Retail Asia Expo in Hong Kong between the 10th to 12th of May. So if you're a retail leader, please ping us on whichever channel you're watching on for a free invitation. But with that being said, Todd, I'd love to thank you for your time and your insights, and looking forward to maybe delving in a little bit deeper on another one.
Yeah, I think there's hours and hours of this that we can rip into, and it's evolving at such a speed that the concepts and thoughts and processes out there, certainly my thinking has evolved over the past 18 months as well. And so it's definitely something that all retailers just need to stay across and then find that natural crossroads in their business of when the evolution makes sense. So my last thing would be, those 4 points of that when your business is ready. It's got natural complexity. It's got defined growth. It's got a internal desire and maturity to want to go down that kind of technology path, and that you have channel diversification. So you don't want to be just a website. You want to sell through multiple different revenue streams. If you tick all those 4 boxes, then call Paul and he'll fix you.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much, and we'll catch you next time.